The Iran-Contra affair and how it affected America. In Nicaragua, between the years 1978 and 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, overthrew the oppressive Somoza dictatorship that had been enriching itself through corporate bribes and foreign aid, doing very little to benefit its largely impoverished people. The FSLN was a self-described Marxist-Leninist group that sought to liberate its people and offer a better life for Nicaraguans by reforming the government. The new Sandinista government, being a military revolutionary government, was just as authoritarian as the Somoza regime. In the absence of adequate government funding, the Sandinista government quickly began confiscating farmland, certain threatening businesses, as well as the personal funds of Nicaraguans who had been absent from the country for over 6 months. This new socialist-oriented government, severely lacking in funding, caught Soviet attention rapidly, with the Soviet Union being the first country to recognize the FSLN government within 2 days of its establishment. Extensive talks and summits began between the revolutionary government and USSR. The year following their takeover, a Soviet economic aid package of $10 million was implemented. 1 year later, in 1981, the USSR and Soviet bloc gave $160 million in military equipment to Nicaragua, as estimated by the CIA. The Soviet Union's interests in supporting the Sandinistas were equally matched by the Reagan administration's intentions to prevent them. The primary group combating the Sandinista government were known as the Contras, a guerrilla militant organization which sought to restore democracy in Nicaragua. The Contras saw that the new government had become corrupted by power, and its seizures of property and communist ideals had to be stopped. Their primary goal was to overthrow the Sandinista government and to restore true democracy in Nicaragua. The Contras acted on their goals with sporadic attacks on Sandinista military installations, personnel, as well as government installations, such as the Russian tank seen here. The U.S. recognized the Democratic Contras and saw them as their primary resource to fight against the Soviet influences gaining traction in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration saw Soviet money backing a government on the American continent as a threat to national security. Because of this, the Reagan administration became highly interested in funding this right-wing terrorist group in the name of protecting democracy and pushing the Soviets off of the continent. The above 1982 CIA document explains the scope of intended activities by the CIA in support of the Contras against the FSLN. The document reads, "We will aid the democratic Nicaraguan leaders and their organizations in their efforts to increase internal resistance to the FSLN and to create a paramilitary potential to punctuate their resolve to effect changes in Nicaraguan government policies. This assistance will be in the form of funding, arms supply, and some training." Prior to the aforementioned CIA initiative, America gave its first package of financial aid to the Contras in 1981. The expansion of this led the way to a total of $322 million given in aid between 1981 and 1990 from the USA to Nicaraguan right-wing militias. The Truman Doctrine, or containment, had been a hot topic of debate in America after the fruitless ending to the Vietnam War. Reagan brought the new Reagan Doctrine with the hopes of preventing communism without direct military intervention. The Reagan Doctrine had the goal to roll back Soviet-backed pro-communist governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In Vietnam, the U.S. fought for 20 years, spending over $168 billion on the basis of preventing the spread of communism internationally. The failure of the war resulted in a new lack of faith in government. The Reagan administration, having restored a lot of the public faith in government in its first term, was also keen to continue to contain communism, as can be seen by funding the Contras. However, it was determined to not show any similarity to Vietnam in the public eye. By strictly funding the Contras through the CIA and not supplying direct military support, the administration briefly went under the radar of Congress, however not for long. In 1982, Democratic House Representative Edward Boland spearheaded the congressional opposition to Reagan's involvement in the foreign conflict, also bringing this involvement into the public light. Representative Boland drafted an amendment barring use of funds for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua or provoking a military exchange between Nicaragua and Honduras. The public in Congress had seen what happened in Vietnam and opposed anything of similarity. The 1982 Boland Amendment was approved by Congress and was followed by a continuation of congressional policy limiting government spending in Nicaragua throughout the 1980s. The immediate response from the CIA after the passage of the Boland Amendment for the 1983 budget was to examine the legal language of the document to understand how to continue to support the Contras. as can be seen in this CIA document. The document examines journalistic interpretations and legal interpretations of the amendment in the aim to sidestep the newly imposed limitations. A year prior to the Boland Amendment, in May of 1982, a Nicaraguan Sandinista government delegation made its first official visit to Moscow, thus further raising the Reagan administration anxieties for the growing Soviet strength in Central America. Seeing this as a national security threat, Reagan did not wish to follow the limitations of the Boland Amendments and began funding the Contras in secret with the help of the Central Intelligence Agency and National Security Council Deputy Director Oliver North. In order to fund the Contras, despite the Boland Amendment, the Reagan administration secretly sold military equipment to Iran, breaking its vow to maintain Jimmy Carter's embargo on Iran, as well as its own Operation Staunch, which aimed to prevent any nation from selling arms to Iran. The profits from these secret arms sales, which were unknown to Congress, were then sent to fund the Contras in their fight for democracy. It is clear how adamant Reagan was to prevent Soviet control in Nicaragua, even going so far as to defy Congress and weaken the stability of federal checks and balances. President Reagan had great respect for the Contras, going as far as to call them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers, according to the New York Times. However, looking at his illegal efforts to fund what was commonly referred to as a terrorist organization, it's essential to examine the administration's moral ambiguity in the name of fighting communism. So let us delve deeper into the Contras themselves. Although it was in the name of fighting a communist regime, the Contras committed numerous human rights abuses throughout the 1980s, which the Reagan administration neglected. There are many on record from human rights investigations ordered both from Congress and nonprofit global organizations. However, some of the most significant include the Contras attacking civilian economic targets such as lumberyards, coffee plants, and electrical power stations like the one seen in this image, resulting in Nicaraguan civilian casualties rather than their Sandinista opponents. In one instance, in July 1986, Contra couriers killed 3 Nicaraguan Baptist relief workers and a social worker, whose houses and clinic they then burned. A 1985 investigation by the International Human Rights Law Group found that state vehicles would be targeted by Contra groups. With civilians being mixed in with government officials, all passengers would be killed, including civilians. The same report contains an eyewitness account from a woman whose husband was killed as suspected to be a Sandinista officer by Contra forces. Her husband was in fact a carpenter. The Contras were also widely known to make use of child soldiers in their efforts against the Sandinistas. It's essential to note that Congress put effort in place to prevent such occurrences, and the Reagan administration broke the law to continue to fund this group. These reports of American-funded violence show just how far Reagan was willing to go to stop Soviet intervention in Nicaragua, even at the cost of innocent civilian lives. In an effort to guide the public opinion of the Contras, the Reagan administration set up a public diplomacy office on Central America under the State Department and CIA Director William Casey, with the goal of keeping the American public informed on where their tax dollars were going. Most interesting about this public diplomacy office was the fact that those appointed to lead it were not press experts or journalists. However, they were Department of Defense propaganda specialists. A 1988 Washington Post article found from declassified internal documents that this office was headed by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Jacobowitz, who had a background in psychological warfare, and the office employed 5 other Psy-War specialists from the 4th Psychological Operations Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. An internal memo stated that they were assigned to find exploitable themes and trends. If the Contras were as morally equivalent to the Founding Fathers as Reagan claimed, it is curious as to why he assembled a propaganda team to manage the public opinion of the organization. Ronald Reagan not only went behind the backs of Congress in funding them, but also put significant effort into lying to the American people about who the Contras really were. These anti-Soviet freedom fighters that America backed were in fact a terrorist organization. The Contras are a representation of how much further Reagan was willing to go in the fight against communism than the rest of the nation. The Iran-Contra affair remains today a significant smear in the history of American foreign policy, In a time when faith in government was most necessary, Reagan failed to give it to the American people.